So yeah, historic graffiti, applied markings, and buildings archaeology. Well, I'm going to start really with everything that isn't graffiti. So I get a lot of emails, obviously, having written a book a long time ago on medieval graffiti. I get a lot of emails from people kind of saying, basically, what's this? And 50% of the time, no, 70% of the time, it's usually one of the usual suspects, as it were. So I'm going to do a very brief run through on everything we come across in buildings that isn't graffiti to begin with. So obviously, to begin with, the earliest markings that we'll find on any stone building are mason's marks. There's lots of traditional narratives associated with Mason's mark. You know, the general idea that each Mason had his own individual mark, and he would use it to mark up the stonework. You know, that a stone he'd worked on, an area he'd worked on, so that at the end of the week or the month or the project, the master mason could come along and work out, how much to pay him. That is these days generally regarded as, well, generally wrong, a complete oversimplification. There's also ideas that Mason's marks could be passed from father to son, which in the UK we really don't have any evidence of either. These marks do tend to be fairly recognisable because they tend to be chisel cut. They are very precise and they're usually geometric. A good selection of examples there in front of you. However, these days we also know that there are lots of different types of Mason's marks. We've got banker marks, which are essentially created when the large stone blocks are cut in the quarry. These tend to be, well, quite often they're axe cut. They will be larger and often cruder. We've also then got our finishing Mason's marks. These, again, you'll find on different parts of the stone, usually the decorative areas. We've then got walling masons, we know from medieval surviving contracts, and we have in a few instances, including one possible at Bodiam Castle, got a master mason's mark. So essentially a master mason signing off on a job. That remains to be published, though, along with a lot of other material. Very occasionally as well, we will get setting out marks from the masons themselves. Now, these are incredibly useful from a buildings archaeology point of view, simply because they give us insights into the construction process and the geometry used to create many of these structures. So a lot of these you will find, obviously, within ecclesiastical settings. You'll often find them, on piers as center lines or marking out edges of doorways. You can often see where they've marked out the larger block and then use that as a guide for carving. So again, all incredibly useful, but not graffiti. Moving on to timber work, of course, the one of the things that I'm often presented with in emails or at the end of lectures are carpenter's marks. Now, the idea about behind a carpenter's mark is really straightforward. I'm sure most of you here, pretty experienced. You've come across a lot of these. In general, they take the form of a type of Roman numeral. You do get those which are modern numbers, but they are fairly rare. So most of the time we're looking at variations on sort of Roman numerals. They don't follow Roman numerals exactly. Now, the idea behind these, of course, is that these are being applied by the carpenters as they're actually laying out and setting out and jointing the timber frame in the framing yard. So the idea is that you create your timber frame, you mark up your joints, so when you're actually putting it in situ, you get it all in the right order. The joke being it's often like a slightly better put together IKEA kit. These examples, you see a nice set here from Oxburgh Hall on one of the 16th century roof structures in, I think it's the Northwest Range. Incredibly useful from a buildings archaeology point of view, because if we've got a nice series which are all in order, then we can be pretty certain that the building hasn't been too heavily messed about with. They tend to come in two forms. So the general idea is that the earlier form tend to be freehand. As you see the example on the left here, again from Oxburgh Hall in Norfolk, and later ones tend to be chisel cut. That isn't always the case, of course. As most of the textbooks, they tend to oversimplify some of these. The idea, of course, is, as you can see here, that you've actually got matching numbers on both sides of the joint. So you can just make out we've got a 7 on both sides of this timber joint. This is from a circa 1500 pilgrim hostel in Walsingham in North Norfolk. And you'll also notice for the keen-eyed people there, we've got an insertion of a later ridge board. Wouldn't have been in part of the original building, so they've actually cut into that joint to insert the ridge board. That is not recommended practice. So as I said, the idea is that freehand examples tend to be earlier, chisel cut tend to be later. That isn't always the case. This is looking down on a floor frame, again from that same circa 1500 pilgrim hostel in Walsingham. And you will note that on the right-hand side, you've got a nice chisel cut 10. And on the left-hand side, clearly a later insertion, a later repair, where it is still marked up as 10, but it is freehand. And we also come across buildings where, even though the entire structure is of the same construction phase, both types of marks are used. This is a schematic of the northeast wing north range from Oxborough Hall, which was done as part of the Raising the Roof project, which is a project we worked on through the COVID pandemic. Now, this floor frame is all contemporary, but you'll notice that we've actually got two very, very clearly distinctive different types of carpenter's mark here. So on the right-hand side, we've got freehand markings. On the center section, we have nice, neat chisel cut markings. What's happening here is quite simply we've got two sets of carpenters working on the same frame. So even in a building which we know from a dendro dating is all the second half of the 16th century, we've actually got both types of mark being applied. Now, the wonderful thing about these carpenter's marks, of course, is they can really help us with understanding and the diagnostics of building construction. So this again is from Oxborough Hall. This is the Western Range roof. This was a bit of an oddity in the fact that Oxborough Hall, for those of you who know it, was meant to have been built by the Bellingfeld family in the very last decades of the 15th century. However, this particular range, this particular roof, had been fairly accurately dendro dated to between 1437 and 1463. Now, one of the ideas was that this was reused from elsewhere, but actually by looking at the carpenter's marks, you can see the ones on the left are not in order, but by the time you get to 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, those are still in series. You'll note also the red timber there. That is actually a very decorative wall plate. So the area where the carpenter's marks were still in situ also had this very decorative wall plate still in situ. So at least that part of that roof structure was still in situ. Number 11 appears to be missing, but number 12 had been moved and put in its place. 12 was always meant to be the end truss, so therefore when they shortened the range, they'd removed 11 and put 12 in its place. So as I say, carpenter's marks can be incredibly useful from a building's history point of view. Even the carpenter's marks which aren't in series can, of course, at least point us to where changes have taken place. The other thing as well, which a lot of young students don't pick up on, is we often get differences to carpenter's marks depending on the side of their building they are on. So again, this is our circa 1500 pilgrim hostel in Walsingham, and you will see we're looking down on a bridging beam and our floor joists, and we are looking at joint number 13. You will note that on the right-hand side, we have a tag attached to the last of the minims there on the number 13. And all of the carpenter's marks on that side of the building have that additional tag. This is so the carpenters can basically work out their left from right, which side of the building it comes from. So again, if you've got mixed up tags on both sides of the buildings, chances are your timbers are not in situ. And when I said that these actually take the form of Roman numerals, they kind of do, but not always. So what we see across East Anglia, the South East and the East Midlands, is there are certain economies being applied to these markings. So instead of XV being used for 15, we will often see this mark, which is basically a conjoined X and V together. And for a number 9, we'll often see this mark being used, which is very like the government broad arrow mark, in this case, slightly obscured by a nail. But yeah, this does lead particularly some less experienced conservation officers and buildings archaeologists to suggest that the timbers aren't in situ when in fact they are. So very occasionally also we come across other marks left by the carpenters, and this can include a lot of the decorative setting out schemes and some of their own basic geometric workings. This is the rear of the door for the screens passage from Knoll down near Sevenoaks. And the front of the door has got very elaborate carving on it. And when we examined the back, we realized that actually this too had been set out to have this same very elaborate carved design. But they'd obviously, after having set it out, they decided as it was the rear of the door, as it was going to be open most of the time, they didn't need to actually apply the decoration. So we actually have the construction markings on the back of the door itself, but no evidence that was anything ever applied. This again is incredibly useful from a buildings archaeology point of view in the fact that it gives us real insight into the construction process and the basic geometry that was needed and even the tools that were needed to create some of this very elaborate carving. These architectural inscriptions aren't just limited to timberwork and the vernacular. We come across them a lot in ecclesiastical architecture. Well, I say a lot. When I first began looking at graffiti, I suppose about 15, 16 years ago now, there were very, very few of these architectural inscriptions known about in the whole of the UK. I think it was less than 2 dozen. Over the last 15 years, we have, using many of the volunteer surveys and many of the large-scale graffiti surveys in our larger ecclesiastical buildings, we've identified over 60 more examples. So we've more than tripled the number that are known about. This example is from Weston Longville Church, just near Norwich in Norfolk. And as you can see, it is tiny. It is not a fully worked out design. This is what my father would have called a back of the fag packet sketch. This is the mason working out the basic geometry needed to create a tracery window design. And according to Arnold Pacey, who is the great expert in these architectural inscriptions, he believes it actually relates to a window that still exists on the south side of the chancel. You can see it is not a finished design. So it is what we think of essentially as a schematic. And the whole thing is only about 140 millimeters across. Now, these architectural designs, as I say, we find them all over the place. And it appears essentially that the medieval craftsmen took a fairly pragmatic approach to the design process. Why carry a large drawing board around with you when you had a nice, handy, flat wall nearby? I've even come across examples where they've actually used walls which are still covered in wall paintings. So if you go to Swannington, again in Norfolk, there's a very large sort of 8-9 foot tall St Christopher as you walk in the main south door. And if you look closely, one of the later medieval architects has created an almost full-size architectural inscription and literally just cut straight through the pigment of this wall painting with no attempt to cover their work up afterwards. So they clearly sort of took a very pragmatic approach. This rather lovely example is from Flamstead in Hertfordshire, and it was again one of 3 architectural inscriptions discovered there. In common with most of the architectural inscriptions that we come across, we could not identify exactly what this related to in the church. If anything, it may well have been related to a large part of the now lost rood screen or a decorative element that was no longer there. Again, you'll notice not a complete design. They've only finished one of the quadrants in this design because that's all they needed to do to understand the geometry that was going to be involved. So they would lay out only as much as they needed, essentially, to create the final finished design. And a nice example here, which was recently brought to my attention by Nat Cohen from Canterbury Cathedral. This is up in one of the main towers and hasn't been previously recorded. Again, it is the design for the upper section of a 6-light window. You'll notice that they're using the mortar line there between the stones as their baseline, and that they haven't actually bothered putting in the mullions beneath. Now, that is really common with many of the architectural inscriptions that we come across in churches and cathedrals. The mullions, well, essentially for most of them, they know exactly what they're going to do. They're going to go straight down, so you don't need to draw them. So a lot of the architectural inscriptions we're coming across, you will only ever find the upper section. And as I said, these are incredibly important for giving insight essentially into the medieval design process. So it isn't just on the stonework that we find these. This is from the back of the rood screen in Caston in Norfolk. The backs of rood screens have been an incredibly useful place when it comes to architectural inscriptions. We've recorded at least a dozen now on the back of the rood screens, most of which have never been looked at before. And I think part of the problem is a lot of people have looked at rood screens, but they're all looking at the pretty bits on the front. And until very recently, with the likes of Lucy Rapson and Spike Bucklow, no one has really been looking at the back or even the construction technique. So the vertical lines you see there are actually the boards that make up the dado section of the rood screen itself. So this inscription has clearly been created in situ. And again, it isn't complete. You'll only see sections of it done. And we believe it actually relates to the upper section of the rood screen itself. So that's telling us that actually, first of all, the screen is probably being constructed on site, which we do have a couple of documentary references for, but also that the dado section is already in place when they're actually finishing and finalizing the designs for the upper section of the screen. This example again is on the back of the screen at Blythburgh down into Suffolk, probably one of the best surviving and most famous of all rood screens. And here, this is again, it's going across boards. You can see from the scale there that this is essentially kind of done at 1-to-1. So it's again clearly created in situ, and it appears to relate to the gallery section at the top of the screen. So again, evidence that they are designing the upper sections of the screen whilst the bottom half of the screen is already in situ. So as I say, it really is giving insights into the design process because they are, quite simply making it up in some cases as they go along. Something else I'm going to touch on very, very briefly is taper burn marks. These have become a bit of a hot topic recently, if you'll excuse the pun. Quite a few people writing on them. The general consensus these days is that these taper burn marks are not accidental. James Wright has carried out a variety of experiments to prove that actually to create one of these taper burn marks is really quite difficult. And we find them on most of our buildings that have a timber frame. We find them on churches. We find them on basically every type of historic building that we look at. There is some evidence that a lot of these are created when the timber is green, when it's freshly cut. As you can see, this example from Sissinghurst Castle, if you look at the one on the left where the blue arrow is, you'll see that the crack, the seasoning crack that occurs usually in the first 10 to 15 years, has actually distorted the top of the taper burn mark, which rather suggests that the taper burn mark was there before the crack was. Now, the idea behind these, I say there's lots of theories at the moment. One of the ideas is that essentially these are designed to protect a building from fire, or in particular lightning, essentially fighting fire with fire. And we are starting to notice quite distinct patterns in the way they are being, in the way they're being created, and certainly in the way we're recording them these days. So one of the most interesting that I've come across recently is the back of church doors. And if you are looking at any surviving sort of early church door and you look at the back of it, chances are in the middle of the door will be either a single taper burn mark or a collection of taper burn marks. And I mean, I have recorded hundreds of sites, churches, where we do have these taper burn marks. Tim Easton has suggested they're often found near spy holes in church doors. And one of the ideas he's put forward is that that spy hole essentially is seen as a way that evil spirits can enter a building, and therefore it needs some form of protection. Um, Interesting that that's not what we're seeing in Norfolk and elsewhere, where spy holes in church doors are a bit of a rarity, with the exception of this one at Litcham, which is actually going into the tower. And as I say, we will either find single examples, which suggests that they're associated with a single event, such as consecration, or examples where taper burn marks have been applied again and again and again. So churches such as Eton, just outside Norwich, the rear of the door there, which dates back to the 13th century, is absolutely covered in these taper burn marks, some of which have clearly got tool markings in the centre. So they burnt it, they scraped away the charcoal, and then they've reburnt these timbers. And it's not just our smaller sites as well. I recently was with Graham Keevil down at Salisbury Cathedral, and we got to talking about, we were looking at the graffiti and applied markings, and we got to talk about taper burn marks. And he said, where am I likely to find these? And I said, well, if we've got surviving medieval doors, they'll be in the centre of those. And we went and we looked at every single surviving medieval door, and everyone had a collection of taper burn marks in the back. So, as I say, it isn't just our smaller buildings where these are present. There is a lot written about these, a lot of theories. I think there is, we are yet to reach a consensus regarding these. And with most of our applied markings, I personally have the opinion there's probably more than one thing actually going on. This is a schematic from one wall that we recorded during the project at Knoll down in Sevenoaks. And this wall dates back to about 1450. And you can see the timber studs there were absolutely covered in these taper burn marks all the way along. You'll also notice there's a couple of them there on the right-hand side, which are behind an inserted timber. Now, that inserted timber was put in about 1603, 1605, and it left a gap of about 25 millimeters between those two timbers. So the taper burn marks on the original medieval timbers can only have been applied before 1603, 1605. As I said, I'm not really going to talk about those much. I thought as we build this as a talk on graffiti, I might actually start talking about some graffiti for a change. So I started recording graffiti in churches basically by accident. I was at the time looking at medieval wall paintings. I was running a medieval wall painting project down at Lakenheath Church on the border of Norfolk and Suffolk. And the conservators brought my attention to the fact that we had graffiti inscriptions actually cut through the pigment of the wall paintings. And some of these were clearly early. Some of these were definitely pre-Reformation. And I realized there wasn't a lot written on the subject. So I decided to go and look at some of our other surviving medieval churches across East Anglia and start looking to see if there was anything worth recording. That, of course, now is also ancient history. But it turns out that, yes, most of our churches and historic buildings, cathedrals, castles, whatever, are absolutely covered in historic graffiti. The rule of thumb that we adopted during some of the community surveys was essentially if a church hadn't been too heavily messed about with by the Victorians, and if it wasn't still covered in Reformation limewash, then early historic graffiti would be present. These are fairly typical surfaces in some of our churches. So on the left there, an example from Troston in Suffolk, and on the right from Sedgeford in Norfolk. Now, you'll note that many of the dates in there, particularly at Sedgeford, they are all post-Reformation. Now, when we started doing, in particular, the community surveys, we decided that we would take an archaeological approach to recording. And what that meant essentially is that we were not going to make any judgment about whether something was worthy of recording or not, that we would create a baseline survey of everything that had been inscribed into the structure. What that meant, of course, is that we're creating a baseline for the future. So we can come back in 10, 15 years' time, and we can see, any graffiti inscriptions that may have been lost, which is always a good indicator that something going on with a building, something bad usually, or in some cases, of course, what's been added. You have to remember that graffiti is not a static corpus. It is constantly being added to. We are also seeing constant losses. So even if a building has been looked at and it's been looked at, 15, 20 years ago, it is always worth going to have another look. Excuse me. So the most common type of graffiti inscription you're going to find on any historic building are basically what you're looking at here. This is examples from a small section of Norwich Anglican Cathedral. We are essentially looking at names, dates, and initials. Now, what can these possibly tell us, that is useful from either a buildings history point of view or, from the archaeological record beyond someone with the initials SB rather, probably visited Norwich Cathedral in 1645. Well, we realized that actually when we were recording these in enough numbers, when we had that massive data sets, that actually it was starting to give us a few indications that there were other things going on. Now, what happened really is people started to notice that we were seeing some quite unusual patterns in the letters that were being recorded amongst these initials and names and things. And in particular, the letter J, the letter R, the letter T, and the letter W were appearing far more commonly than any of the other initials. Now, in certain circles, this led people to come up with some slightly questionable theories. It was suggested, and I'm going to use the word here, it was suggested there may be some sort of ritual activity going on. Because surely this could not be a normal distribution pattern. Surely, when you're looking at that peak there for the letter J, that's not natural. This is not something that would be occurring amongst normal frequency analysis. As I say, this led people to start to come up with some interesting ideas about initials having, or pairs of letters having ritual significance. So JC became Jesus Christ, PM became Pax Maria. The thing is, the pattern was real. What you're looking at here is the results of a survey from Norwich Cathedral in blue and a matching survey undertaken at Rochester Cathedral in the kind of burgundy dark red here. And you can see that we really are seeing very, very distinct peaks amongst these letters that are appearing. What's going on? Well, the only answer was to actually take a step back and look at the documentary sources, as all good archaeologists always should. And so one very, very boring winter, I spent an awful long time going through a large number of documentary references, looking at the naming traditions in England from the medieval period all the way through to essentially the modern. This is just one example here. This is the wills from the Archdeaconry of Sudbury, covering the period 1461 to 1474. And I went through hearth tax returns, I went through militia assessments. All of this was eventually published in an article in Post-Medieval Archaeology. And what we realized is exactly the same pattern was turning up in the documentary record. And essentially, everyone was called John. So between the period of about 1450 and 1850, most of the about 80% of the male population of England shared the same five first names. So you were looking at John, Thomas, William, Robert, and Richard. As I say, 80% of males had those names, which is why I think, I suspect you get so many nicknames and descriptive nicknames in the documentary evidence. So, in fact, what we were picking up with those patterns, those frequency patterns at places like Norwich and Rochester, was in fact not something ritual. It was, in fact, just reflecting the male naming traditions in England between about 1450 and 1850. Now, of course, that in itself suddenly threw up a really big question because we'd suddenly identified gender bias in historic graffiti. This was something I was asked about many years ago, and I had to at the time say no, there was no way of really identifying whether inscriptions were being created by male or female. What it appears, though, is that at least in the post-medieval period, the majority of the inscriptions are being created by men. Now, the next question people always ask is, why is that? And I have to say at this point, I do not know. There are lots of theories. One of the theories that often is put forward at the moment is that men are carrying the tools to create the graffiti. Like my grandfather always used to carry around a penknife, as did his father before him. So maybe it is simply access to the tools to make these. Is it because men are more territorial? That's been suggested. But this not only appears in the initials, this also appears when we record actual first names as well. Getting male first names is relatively common, having the whole first name amongst the graffiti. Female names are a real rarity. So that does appear that even by looking at something as simple as these initials, these I was here graffiti, that we can actually start, when we're looking at it in large enough scale, we can actually start getting useful information, about the past from there as well. Now, very briefly, one of the other most common graffiti markings that we come across are what are known as apotropaic markings, sometimes referred to as ritual protection marks. Usually in October in the Daily Mail, they are invariably referred to as witch marks. They have nothing to do with witches or witchcraft whatsoever. I prefer to refer to them, as they are still referred to in many of the Baltic countries, as holy signs. Now, an apotropaic mark is essentially a mark or a symbol that is designed to ward off evil. It is designed to drive out the devil in some cases. Now, these marks are really, really common. And to some people today, the whole concept of an apotropaic mark is a bit difficult to kind of understand. So what I tend to do is point them towards one motif, one apotropaic symbol that is still in common and everyday use to this day, and is very, very specifically designed to, ward off evil and drive out the devil. And that is the cross or the crucifix. Still used by churches throughout the Western world. It's used as part of the baptism ceremony to mark the child and drive out the devil. It's used during the consecration process to literally make a place fit for worship. So at its most fundamental level, many of these apotropaic markings are sometimes alternatives and occasional replacements for the cross or the crucifix. And they certainly derive their power. They certainly derive their or gain their function from the cross or the crucifix. On the top left, there is one of the most common of all these markings that you will find in any historic building, which is the six-petal rosette, sometimes misleadingly referred to as the hexfoil or the hexafoil. This we can demonstrate in the early medieval period in particular is quite often used as a direct replacement for the cross or crucifix. It's used on medieval cross slabs to replace the standard four-armed cross. It is used in certain instances as consecration crosses, painted consecration crosses in churches. So as I say, a lot of these markings, most of these markings, derive their power from the cross. And they certainly turn up in massive quantities. Essentially, if you go into any ecclesiastical building and it has any historic graffiti surviving whatsoever, the chances are one of these symbols will be present. And some of them can be exceptionally discreet, a few, 10, 20 millimeters across. Other ones can be, 250, 300 mil across, and deeply cut into the stonework as well. So, and it isn't just the stonework we find them on. We'll also find them on the timber work. We will find them on the lead work. We will even find them engraved into the glass in the windows. So these are essentially ubiquitous, and you will find them all the way across Western Europe. I mean, I can go into a church in Scandinavia and a church in Spain and see exactly the same marks. You can go into a church in Northumberland and a church in Tuscany, I wish, and you'll see exactly the same marks. There are regional differences, and we are starting to see regional differences. So, for example, the six-petal rosette is much more commonly found in Northern Europe, whereas the pelter design, the knotwork cross, is more commonly found in Southern Europe. Interestingly, in the UK and most of the Low Countries, those two traditions, this North and South tradition, appear to meet. So they're fairly equally distributed here. And they do turn up in absolutely massive numbers. This is one tiny part of a wall surface from Whittlesford Church in Cambridgeshire. And you can see, I've marked it up here, that you can see there's lots more graffiti going on here. But these are, I think there's over 60 examples of just compass drawn motifs actually in that one church. And it's not alone. You can see the same at Coolidge. You can see the same at Lydgate, loads of places. These, once you start looking, these are literally all over the place. Moving on, though, one other thing that we do come across, particularly amongst ecclesiastical graffiti, are these. These were a bit of a puzzle when I first came across them. It's very clear that someone has been drilling holes into our ecclesiastical buildings. You will often find them drilled in patterns. So they will be in patterns of 5, in patterns of 6, in patterns of 9, or in 7. Sometimes they'll be in the form of a cross, as the examples from Coolidge on the bottom left there, or actually as the terminals to a cross, as you see the examples there from Walsham Le Willow. Now, as I say, I was puzzled by these because certain churches you go to, such as Share, down in near Guildford, there are absolutely hundreds of these drilled into the church. And it was only when talking to some of our continental counterparts that they basically said, yeah, we know what these are. People were still making them until very recently. And essentially, this is people drilling out the stone, not to make the mark as such, but what they're doing is they are collecting the powder. So what we have here are sort of visual fragments or visual, leftovers from aspects of folk medicine. Now, in France and in Italy, until very recent decades, people were going along and they were doing this either on churches, cathedrals, or even in some cases, things like glacial erratics. And they would then take the powder and they would mix it with wine or ale or water, and they would drink it. And it was being used as essentially a cure-all. Certain places and certain objects got reputations for being particularly good at curing certain ailments. So there's a whole series of stones in Italy which are known as fever stones, because when you grind up the stone and take that as as a medicine, it's particularly good against fever. Now, the logic behind this is actually, there's almost the logic behind it. When a church is first built, it has to be consecrated. And to consecrate a church, it has to be anointed by a bishop with holy oil. So those stones themselves become holy. So logically, therefore, by grinding up some of the stone and taking it as part of a medicine, you are taking part of the that holiness within yourself. So as I said, some of these, they may look like graffiti, but in fact, what we're looking at there is folk medicine. The same goes for these, which I'm sure you've all come across, scratch styles or mass styles. Again, there is a tradition here, particularly put forward by people like the Sundial Society. Yes, they exist. The Sundial Society, who these are meant to be crude sundials. There's a lot more going on than just that, is my own personal opinion. We've got quite a few sites, such as Shia, where you have multiple examples of these scratch tiles actually being created on the same doorway. And in most cases, they are pretty much identical. About a quarter of all examples are also found on the north side of the church. So how does that work? A lot of the time, particularly when you look at some of the traditional literature on this, they'll say, "Oh, well, it's been reused. It's a stone that's been, taken from the south side and reused on the north side." That is, of course, possible. Why then are they all about shoulder height? Why are they reusing these stones on the north side about shoulder height? There is something else going on here if someone fancies a really interesting research project. They are sundials. Some of them clearly work as sundials, but there is also a lot more going on here. Why does a church need 10 scratch tiles around one door, which is underneath a porch, which was built in the 15th century? What are they meant to be doing? Showing the time in London, New York, and Tokyo? No, there is something else going on here. So as I say, areas for further research. Now, there we go. We are almost 45 minutes into the talk, and I'm only just starting to talk about graffiti. So basically, what are we finding? Well, essentially, everything and anything you can possibly imagine. If it turns up in medieval art, if it turns up in medieval sculpture, if it turns up in medieval wall paintings or stained glass, the chances are you will also find it on the walls. What you have to remember is that the graffiti is not created in isolation. It is essentially just a reflection of what we're finding elsewhere in medieval society. So we're finding, everything that you can possibly imagine. And I'm just going to give you a very, very brief run through some of the main things we come across. Now, a lot of it, particularly when we're looking at churches and our religious buildings, is exactly what you'd expect to find. It is fairly typical Orthodox imagery. So examples such as the IHS motif, the Holy Monogram, as it's known, from Welbourne Church in Lincolnshire, particularly nice example. It may look like the letter C, but this is actually the long medieval S. That changes in kind of the middle of the 16th century. So if they're using the long S, the chances are this is created before the middle, before the Reformation. Example from the top right there from Sawston, just outside Cambridge, simply reads, Miserere me Deus, may God have mercy upon me. Interestingly, in this case, it's repeated around the church and it's associated with the name Wotton, who was actually the parish priest in Sawston back in the middle of the 15th century. So clearly these inscriptions are being created by anyone and everyone, everyone from the Lord of the Manor all the way down to the parish priest. And sometimes, of course, people are just making their mark. This is a particularly lovely example I discovered only quite recently from Share Church down near Guildford. And unusually, it's pre-Reformation from the letter forms, and it simply reads, Casse was here, unusually in English. So sometimes it is just people making their mark, wanting to leave a mark that they were there. The one thing people always think about when it comes to graffiti, though, the one thing that always springs to mind is text graffiti. Now, sadly, text is actually a bit of a rarity. I used to say it makes up about 5% of all the inscriptions that we record. That's actually probably an over exaggeration. It's more like 2 or 3%. The text inscriptions can be incredibly useful, particularly from a buildings archaeology point of view. This is a lovely inscription from Alphamstone Church down into Essex. and it is made by the parish priest, the parson, Nicholas Le Grice. Now, Nicholas was an interesting character. He was in almost constant conflict with his parish. There's a whole series of legal cases. He's also accused of getting one of his maidservants pregnant. He's a real character. Now, it appears that when Nicholas did any work to the church, he recorded it on the walls. And he left a whole series of graffiti inscriptions across the walls of the chancel and the nave. This is one of the best ones. This reads, "This chancel was repaired with new timberwork by me, Nicholas Le Grice. Anno 1578, so second half of the 16th century here. Now, from a buildings archaeology perspective, this is gold. You can walk in and you can look up at that roof today, and you can say that that looks like 15th or 16th century work. Thanks to inscriptions like Nicholas here, we can actually look up at that roof and go, that's 1578, that is. That's what I call a buildings archaeology result. Some of the text inscriptions as well can also refer to events that simply might not turn up elsewhere in the written record. So this is from the fascinating church of Lydgate in Suffolk, and it reads, "T.S., 18th of January 1583, Anno Elizabeth Viniente Sext, muster at this town." Now, TS in this case stands for Thomas Smythe, who was the muster master in North Essex and South Suffolk in the years leading up to the Armada campaign. So this is referring to a military muster. So gathering together all of your men aged between 16 and 60 to undertake their annual military exercises, an excuse for some military training and quite a lot of fun, drinking and having a good time. Interestingly, this is the only account, the only surviving reference we have to a muster taking place in Lydgate in 1583. And it's also interesting that it casts light on the importance of a tiny village like Lydgate. By the late 16th century, Lydgate had shrunk down to being just a hamlet. So why were they carrying out a muster there? This is the sort of activity that was usually carried out in places like market towns. Well, the thing is, just behind the church is the remains of a castle, probably belonging to the period of the anarchy. And so there seems to have been a tradition heading back right into the Middle Ages that Lydgate was a place where musters took place, even though the village itself had declined in importance. Other things we come across, people, faces. There's a joke among some of the graffiti hunters that basically if you stare at the walls for long enough, you soon find them staring back. And it's not too far from the truth. People are fascinated by people. So lovely example here from Kirtling down into Suffolk, which we can again date to the late 16th century, based on the costume that the individual is wearing with his large trunk hose and peas cod doublet. Some of the others, the one on the bottom right there, the tradition is, that's from Harleton over in Cambridgeshire. And the tradition is there that this is meant to depict Henry VI. I'm not quite sure. I think it's one of those stories that's growing up, such as it's always the choir boys or always the church wardens. I think from an archaeological perspective, all we can say is really it's a kind of crowned head in profile. Other things we come across, animals. A lot of animals. What's interesting though is the animals we come across and the ones we don't come across. So most of the animals we come across are the animals of the hunt. It's the running dogs, it's the deer, it's the hunting hounds, it's the hawks, the hunting hawks. It isn't the animals of the farmyard. So it isn't the cattle, it isn't the pigs, and it isn't the sheep. Well, there's one pig, but it isn't the sheep. Bearing in mind that half the churches in East Anglia are built with money from the wool trade, this lack of sheep, at least, is certainly of interest. So again, the suggestion here is that many of these may actually be devotional in nature. They may be kind of ex voto items, so people asking for and praying for a good hunt rather than praying for a good sheep. Other things, of course, heraldry. Heraldry, we find masses of heraldry on our churches. Heraldry, though, is a bit of a problem. Even when we got really nice examples, such as the one that's top left there from Troston in Suffolk, it is almost impossible to tie down many of these inscriptions with individuals or individual families. And the reason for that, even with these nice examples, is the one thing, of course, we don't get in graffiti, and the one thing that heraldry utterly relies on is colour, is pigment. So that example at the top left there from Troston, over a period of about 350 years, because we have no exact date for this, in different colour schemes, could belong to no less than 6 different families. And interestingly, none of those families, as far as we can see, have any connection with Troston whatsoever. The nearest, I think, is the Smythe family from Lincolnshire. And then coming towards the end, one of the rarest types of inscriptions we come across are musical notation. Now, these do tend to be associated with our larger religious institutions, so our abbeys, our priories, and our cathedrals. So the example there from the example at the top there is actually from Norwich Cathedral. The example at the bottom there is from Horning Church in Norfolk. Now, it doesn't mean that music wasn't incredibly important in the medieval parish. What it means is it was mainly at these larger institutions that they were actually using musical notation as a formal teaching method. Most of these musical inscriptions will be very short. They're not complete compilations, and we believe what they're actually trying to do, because most of this is chant, they're not so much interested in the notes themselves, but actually in the shape of the chant. So where the music rises up and down. One of the largest concentrations of these musical inscriptions we've so far come across is in the area of Lincoln Cathedral, that even to this day is still used by the choir just before they go into the main body of the building. So we think a lot of these are actually teaching aids. And finally, one of my favorite types of graffiti, which I've written a couple of articles on in a slightly obsessive manner, is ship graffiti. Now, when we first started looking for ship graffiti, we believed it was largely confined to coastal areas. And it turned out the reason we were finding it in coastal areas is that's where we were looking for it. So once we started looking further inland, we soon came to realize that actually ship graffiti is all over the place. There's certainly concentrations on the coast, but we're finding it as far inland as kind of Northamptonshire and Bedfordshire. You can't get further from the coast. And in all cases that I have seen, which is many, many hundreds of examples, these all show seagoing vessels rather than riverine craft. So these are all vessels that are, actually seagoing. They're also shown, most of them, in pretty much the same manner, particularly with the early examples. They're all shown with sails furled. They're usually shown with anchors, and they are shown as full hull. And by that, I mean that you're seeing the whole ship as though it was out of the water, rather than how you would normally see it, from the waterline upwards. So there is the idea now that these are kind of have an ex voto function going on there. Anyway, very, very last thing. I just wanted to bring your attention to a project we worked on for the National Trust at Knowle in Kent, where it was one of the largest, it was one of the largest buildings in England. I think it covers 16 acres. But as part of the project, we actually systematically recorded the graffiti from all periods, and we used it as a tool towards the better understanding the buildings archaeology of the house. And it could be everything from builders' sketches found on the wall. These dated mainly from the 19th and 20th century, but we had, in a few cases, other ones that may have gone back a bit further. This particular sketch relates to an area in one of the upper galleries where even to this day, they've got structural issues. And it appears that over the generations, they've all come in and the builders have looked at it and they've sketched out their ideas to cure the problem and left them there on the walls. The problem persists. These tiny little inscriptions are also most informative because they refer to general maintenance issues that were carried out during a period of renovation in 1907 that actually we had no documentary evidence related to whatsoever. So actually, it was these inscriptions that we were able to date some of these works to. And even it gave us insight into some of the events that had taken place. This is possibly one of my favorite inscriptions from Noel, mainly for the spelling. And it says temporary gas pipe for Great Hall, great spelled Grate, for the Hunt Ball, January the 8th, 1895. Um, this was actually in the attic, so they were running a temporary gas supply right through the house just for a single event. So this really gave us insights into the importance of some of those events taking place and the lengths that they would go to at the house just for a one single one-off thing. And then again, we were also finding conversations on the wall. This is in an area of the attics where, as you can see, we've got a whole series of inscriptions, all in different hands. And it starts off recording the big events. So the Great War starting in 1914, a different hand recording the end of the war in 1918. And then the outbreak of the Second World War in a third hand in 1939. And then local events, so a mine at Icehouse Hill, February 42, flying bombs June to October. So in many cases, the walls become an entire conversation. Now, as I'm running out of time, I'm not going to mention our pioneer here. And all I am going to say is finally, what you have to remember is that graffiti is an evolving archive. So in places like Litcham in Norfolk, where the lime wash is now coming away from the walls, we are seeing new inscriptions emerge all of the time. So just because a site has been looked at once doesn't mean it shouldn't be looked at again. And that's not me touting for work. And also that this is sadly, in some cases, recording this is a bit of a race against time. These are two photographs taken of the same inscription 9 years apart. And as you can see, due to a problem with the roof structure, many of these early inscriptions from Troston Church in Suffolk are now actually lost. And lastly, don't believe everything you read on the walls. Um, if anyone wants to know more about many of the things I've been talking about tonight, I do upload all of my site surveys and most of my published works to my academia.edu profile. It's all there free to download. There are also some draft articles there as well. And so are my contact details. So if anyone does feel or want to know a bit more, then please feel free to get in touch.